Every morning before the sun even rises, Sarah laces up her worn-out shoes, kisses her children goodbye, and begins the long, lonely walk to work. 10 miles through the cold, the rain, or the blistering heat, she pushes forward, not for herself, but for the two little faces waiting for her at home. She's a woman of quiet strength who asks for nothing and expects even less. But what Sarah doesn't know is that her life is about to change forever. Because someone has been watching her. Someone who knows a secret that could either break her spirit or lift her from the darkness. What if the very person responsible for all her hardships was the same one who would save her? How would she react when the truth is finally revealed? Would kindness or betrayal win in the end? This is the story of how one woman's resilience is tested and how the kindness of a stranger hides a truth that will change everything she thought she knew. The alarm buzzed in the dark, empty room, its shrill sound cutting through the cold silence. Sarah groaned, pulling herself out of bed, her bones heavy with exhaustion. It was 4:30 a.m., and the rest of the world was still asleep. But Sarah had no choice. The walk was long, and if she didn't leave now, she'd be late. Again. She glanced at the small, dimly lit clock on the nightstand, knowing that her body would beg her for more sleep. But that was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her children, Emma and Noah, were curled up in the bed across the room, their small faces peaceful in sleep. Sarah smiled sadly, tiptoeing around the room to avoid waking them. She slipped into her old worn shoes, the soles so thin she could feel every crack in the pavement when she walked. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She bundled herself in a thin jacket, one that had been patched up so many times that it barely held together. As she closed the door behind her, the icy wind bit into her skin, reminding her just how far she had to go. 10 miles every single day. The road was long and unforgiving. Gravel crunched beneath her feet as she set out under the dark sky, her breath coming out in visible puffs in the cold morning air. Every step felt like an eternity, but she had no choice. There was no car, no bus stop, no one to offer her a ride. The town was small, and in a place like this, people looked the other way. They had their own problems, and Sarah's struggles weren't theirs to bear. As she walked, memories of better days played like a cruel film in her mind. Days when her husband Eric was still alive, when life had hope, before the accident, before the layoffs, before everything had come crashing down. Eric had worked at the local factory, a job that promised stability, a future. But when the factory closed down, thanks to a big corporation moving in and outsourcing the work, it wasn't just Eric who lost his job, it was the entire town. Sarah tried not to think about it too much, about how everything had changed. But as she passed the empty factory on her long walk, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of anger, of betrayal. This was supposed to be their home, their future, and now it was just a place full of broken dreams. Every day felt like a battle, but there was no time to mourn. There were bills to pay, mouths to feed. Sarah had found work at the diner on the edge of town, a job that barely paid minimum wage, but it was all she had. She worked long hours, often coming home after dark, her body aching, her spirit worn. But even in the face of exhaustion, she never showed weakness, not in front of her kids. Emma was just 7, Noah only 5. They didn't need to see their mother break. As Sarah approached the diner, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a dull glow over the empty streets. Her shift started at 6, and she had 10 minutes to spare. She pulled her apron on, tying it around her waist as she stepped through the door. The smell of coffee and greasy bacon hit her nose, but there was no time to enjoy it. The regulars would be piling in soon, and Sarah knew what to expect. She greeted the cook, an older man named Dave, with a tired smile. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. They both understood the grind. As the morning rush began, Sarah moved from table to table, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, her feet aching with every step. The customers were the same as always, a mix of truck drivers, construction workers, and locals who barely noticed her. To them, she was just the woman who brought their food, invisible except for one. Mr. Harris. He was a regular, always sitting at the same booth by the window. He was polite, quiet, But there was something about him. He never seemed to be in a rush, always watching the world outside with a distant expression. He tipped well, something Sarah had come to appreciate in a place where pennies were counted. But beyond that, he was a mystery. "Morning, Sarah," he said, as she approached his table with a pot of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Harris," she replied, pouring his cup. "Same as always?" He nodded, smiling kindly, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. Sarah felt a flicker of discomfort, wondering if he had noticed the bags under her eyes or the way her hands trembled slightly from the cold. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah forced a smile. "Same as always." She quickly moved to the next table, brushing off his question. She didn't want pity. She didn't need it. Life was hard, yes, but she was used to it by now. Complaining wouldn't change anything. Hours passed, the day blurring together as Sarah lost herself in the motions of her job. But beneath her calm exterior, there was a quiet exhaustion that never seemed to leave her. By the time her shift ended, the sky was already darkening, and the walk home felt even longer. She stopped by the grocery store, picking up a loaf of bread and a few cans of soup, the weight of the small bag feeling heavier than it should. When she finally reached home, Emma and Noah were waiting by the window, their faces lighting up when they saw her. It was the only part of her day that brought her real joy. She hugged them both tightly, pushing aside her own exhaustion. They didn't need to know how hard things were. They were too young to carry that burden. "Mommy, can we have soup tonight?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with hope. Sarah smiled, nodding. "Of course, sweetheart." As they sat down to eat, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was doing everything she could, but it never felt like enough. There was always another bill, another struggle, and as much as she tried to push forward, there was a part of her that wondered how long she could keep going. But she had no choice. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another 10 miles, another day at the diner, another battle. Little did Sarah know, everything was about to change. And the man who sat quietly in the corner of the diner, watching her with kind eyes, held the key to a future she couldn't yet imagine. The wind whipped through the small town as Sarah pushed open the door to the diner, the familiar chime of the bell announcing her arrival. The morning rush had already begun, and the same faces filled the booths and bar stools. There were the truck drivers, still waking up, rubbing their eyes and glancing at the clock. There were the construction workers, laughing loudly with each other, already stained with dust and dirt from the early shift. And there, in his usual spot by the window, sat Mr. Harris. To anyone else, he was just another customer, neatly dressed in a worn gray coat, always with a newspaper folded on the table beside him. His quiet presence never drew much attention, but for some reason, Sarah always noticed him, and he noticed her. Their interactions were brief, a simple exchange of pleasantries over coffee and toast. But there was something in the way Mr. Harris looked at her. It wasn't pity, not the kind that made her feel small or less than. It was something different, something that Sarah couldn't quite place. As she made her way toward his booth, the pot of coffee warming her hands, Sarah found herself wondering about him. He came in every day, always around the same time, but no one ever seemed to know much about him. Who was he? Why was he always here alone? "Good morning, Mr. Harris," Sarah greeted him, her voice steady, though her curiosity about him continued to grow. "Morning, Sarah," he replied, looking up from his paper. His eyes were warm, kind, the corners crinkling slightly as he smiled. He tapped the side of his cup, a quiet signal for more coffee. Sarah poured the coffee, the steam rising between them, and couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on her hands for a moment. They were rough from hours of scrubbing dishes, cracked from the cold walks to work, but she quickly pulled them back as soon as the cup was full. "Cold out there today," he said, glancing out the window at the frost-covered street. "Yeah, it's a bit rough," Sarah responded, her voice guarded. She didn't want to talk about how the wind had stung her face that morning, or how she had nearly slipped on the ice in her rush to make it to work on time. She didn't want anyone to know how close to the edge she really was. Mr. Harris noticed the brief pause, the way she avoided talking about herself. It wasn't the first time he'd sensed it. For weeks now, he had observed Sarah, seen the way she moved through life as though it was a burden she carried alone. Her face showed quiet determination, but her eyes told another story. A story of exhaustion, of barely holding it together. He had watched her shuffle between tables, her feet heavy with weariness. He'd noticed how she never spoke about herself, how she brushed off personal questions with a polite smile. She was always there, always working, but something was missing. And that something weighed heavily on him, though he couldn't quite explain why. "You work hard," he said, his voice gentle, but with a weight that made Sarah pause. "I can tell." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his words. No one had ever said that to her before, not in a way that sounded like they truly meant it. She swallowed the lump forming in her throat and forced a smile. "Just doing what I have to," she said lightly, moving to the next table before he could say anything more. But his words stayed with her. They echoed in her mind during the long hours of her shift, as she wiped down tables and refilled drinks. They lingered in the silence of her walk home that night, her breath freezing in the air as she thought about why he was so interested in her. Over the next few weeks, their interactions remained the same. Brief, polite exchanges, but there was an unspoken connection between them. Mr. Harris would ask about her day, his tone always respectful, never intrusive, and Sarah, despite her initial wariness, found herself answering. Slowly, little by little, she started to let her guard down. One cold afternoon, as the snow began to fall outside, Mr. Harris broke the routine. Instead of the usual conversation, he asked her a question that caught her off guard. "Do you ever get a ride to work, Sarah?" She blinked, her hand frozen over his coffee cup, the steam curling between them. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "I walk." "Every day?" Sarah nodded, feeling a slight unease stir in her chest. "It's just easier that way." Mr. Harris set his newspaper down, folding it carefully before meeting her eyes. "That's a long walk," he said, his voice soft, but there was something beneath it, something that felt heavier than simple concern. Sarah shifted on her feet, not sure what to say. No one ever asked her about the walk. No one ever cared enough to notice. But here was Mr. Harris, asking questions that no one else dared to ask. "It's just what I have to do," she replied, a practiced line she had used so many times before. But this time, it felt different. It felt exposed. Mr. Harris studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he stood up from his booth, pulling on his coat. "Let me give you a ride home." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The offer caught her off guard, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. It was a kind gesture, one she hadn't expected, but it felt strange. I I can't ask you to do that," she stammered, trying to mask her surprise. "It's too far, and you don't have to." "I insist," Mr. Harris said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's too cold for you to be walking out there." There was a sincerity in his eyes that made it hard to refuse. For the first time in a long while, someone was offering to help without expecting anything in return. But Sarah's pride kicked in, reminding her of all the times she had learned to rely on no one but herself. Still, the thought of walking through the snow in the biting cold was unbearable. And something about Mr. Harris made her believe that his offer was genuine. After a long pause, she nodded, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." As they walked out of the diner together, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. Who was this man, really? And why did he care so much about her? The ride home was quiet, but it was the beginning of something unexpected. Little did Sarah know, this was just the start of a series of events that would change her life forever. As the weeks passed, Sarah and Mr. Harris's rides home became a quiet routine. He'd show up after her shift, his old sedan parked outside the diner, its engine humming softly in the cold air. Each time, Sarah would hesitate for just a moment before getting in, still unsure of how to handle the kindness he offered so freely. During those rides, there wasn't much conversation, but the silence between them felt comfortable, almost familiar. Mr. Harris never pried, never pushed her to talk about herself, and for that, Sarah was grateful. He'd ask simple questions, how her kids were, if she had any plans for the weekend, and she would give brief, polite answers. But deep down, Sarah began to feel a shift. It was a strange feeling to have someone show up for her, to know that for at least a few minutes each day, she didn't have to walk alone. One evening, as they neared the small apartment where Sarah lived with her children, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. There was something different in his tone, something that made Sarah's heart beat a little faster. "Sarah," he began, keeping his eyes on the road, "I've been thinking about your situation." Her body tensed, unsure of where this was going. She didn't want pity. She didn't need someone telling her how hard her life was. She knew that better than anyone. "Look," he continued, sensing her hesitation, "I know you've been walking to work for a long time, and I've watched how hard you work every single day. I want to help you, but in a more meaningful way." Sarah turned to face him, confusion clouding her expression. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harris pulled the car to a stop outside her apartment building, but didn't turn off the engine. Instead, he reached into the back seat and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Sarah frowned, her fingers trembling as she took it. She looked down at the plain envelope, her name written neatly across the front. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside was something she hadn't expected: car keys. I I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced as she stared at the keys, not daring to believe what she was seeing. Mr. Harris smiled softly, watching her with those same kind eyes. "It's yours, Sarah. A car. I know it's not new, but it runs well, and I had it checked out to make sure it's safe for you and the kids." For a moment, the world stood still. Sarah's mind struggled to process what he was saying. This couldn't be real. No one just gave away cars. This wasn't something that happened to people like her. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head in disbelief. I, I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can, and you will," Mr. Harris replied gently, his voice steady. "I've watched you struggle for long enough. You deserve a break, Sarah. This isn't charity. It's just a way to make things a little easier for you." Sarah stared at the keys in her hand, tears slipping down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. The weight of the world that had been crushing her chest began to lift, just slightly, and she could finally breathe again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "I don't understand." Mr. Harris sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Because I know what it's like to struggle. I've been there before, and I've seen how hard you work just to keep your head above water. You remind me of someone I once knew, and I wanted to help." Sarah was speechless, her heart pounding in her chest. For so long, she had carried the weight of her world alone, never expecting anyone to help her, never allowing herself to hope for more. And now here was this man, this stranger, offering her something that could change her life. The next few days felt like a dream. Sarah drove her children to school for the first time, and the look of pure joy on their faces was worth more than any words could express. For years they had walked beside her, their tiny feet trudging through the snow, rain, and heat. Now they sat safely in the back seat, laughing as they pointed out the passing trees, their excitement contagious. At work, Sarah found herself smiling more, the exhaustion that had once weighed her down now lighter, more bearable. She wasn't constantly looking at the clock, counting the minutes until her long walk home. She could simply do her job and know that at the end of the day, her life was just a little bit easier. One evening, after putting her children to bed, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, the car keys resting in her hand. She had never felt so conflicted in her life, grateful beyond words but also overwhelmed by the kindness of someone who owed her nothing. She couldn't help but wonder why Mr. Harris had chosen to help her. She had spent so many years learning that the world was indifferent to her struggles, that people only looked out for themselves. And yet, here was this man who had given her something she hadn't dared dream of: hope for a better future. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, pulling her from her reverie. Sarah opened it to find Mr. Harris standing on the other side, his familiar smile softening the sharp edges of her worry. "I wanted to check in," he said, his voice gentle. "How's everything going with the car?" Sarah smiled, tears threatening to spill again. It's more than I could ever have imagined. The kids are over the moon. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. He waved a hand, brushing off her words. No need to repay me. Seeing you and your children happy is all the thanks I need. But there was something different in his eyes tonight, something deeper that Sarah couldn't quite place. She felt a slight tug in her chest, a feeling that something wasn't quite right, yet she pushed it aside, not wanting to question the only good thing that had happened to her in a long time. Mr. Harris gave her a final nod before turning to leave, but as he reached the bottom of the steps, he paused. Sarah, he called back softly, there's something I need to tell you, but it's not something I can say right now. I hope you'll understand. Sarah frowned, confused by his words. Before she could ask him what he meant, he was already walking away, leaving her standing in the doorway, the night air cool against her skin. As she closed the door behind her, Sarah's mind raced. Something was coming, something she couldn't quite grasp yet. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of unease mixed with the gratitude that had filled her heart. Mr. Harris had changed her life. But at what cost? Days turned into weeks, and the unease that had flickered in Sarah's mind the night Mr. Harris mentioned having something to tell her refused to fade. Each time she saw him, whether it was during their rides home or when he came to the diner for his usual coffee, she felt the weight of his unspoken words hanging in the air between them. She tried to brush it off. After all, how could she doubt the man who had changed her life? The man who had given her a gift so few would. But deep down, the questions lingered. Why had he been so kind? Why her, of all people? And what was this secret he hadn't revealed? One cold afternoon, just before the first snowfall of the season, Mr. Harris stopped by the diner. But this time, something was different. He wasn't sitting in his usual booth by the window. Instead, he stood by the door, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. Sarah caught his eye as she refilled a customer's coffee, her stomach twisting in knots. Whatever it was that he had been holding back, she could sense it now, and it was heavy. After her shift ended, Sarah found Mr. Harris waiting by his car outside, as he always did. But this time, there was a palpable tension in the air. He opened the passenger door for her, as usual, and she climbed in, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't fully understand. The silence between them stretched, heavier than it had ever been. Sarah glanced at him, waiting for him to speak, but he seemed lost in thought, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Finally, as they pulled onto the quiet road that led to her apartment, Mr. Harris cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled between them. There's something I need to tell you, Sarah, he began, his voice strained as though the words were being forced out. Sarah's heart pounded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She braced herself for whatever was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for what he was about to say. You remember the factory your husband worked at, don't you? Mr. Harris's words came slowly, cautiously, like someone testing the water before diving in. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The factory. It was the one place she had tried to forget, the source of so much of her pain. Her husband, Eric, had worked there for years before it was shut down. His job had been their lifeline, their stability, and when it was taken away, their entire world had crumbled. Eric had struggled to find work afterward, and the stress of it all had taken a toll on him. He had never recovered. Yes, Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. What about it? Mr. Harris's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The company that moved into town, the one that caused the layoffs, it was mine. Sarah felt the words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind reeled as she tried to process what he had just said. His company? The one that had caused the factory to shut down? The one that had ruined so many lives, including her own? She stared at him, her mouth dry, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. You caused the layoffs? Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't realize what my decisions would do to the people in this town. I thought it was just business, just numbers on a spreadsheet. But when the factory closed and people lost their jobs, I started to see the consequences of what I had done. I saw the pain in people's faces, I saw what I had taken from them, and then I saw you. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened, her mind struggling to make sense of it all. This man, the one who had given her so much, was also the one who had taken everything from her in the first place. The irony of it was almost too much to bear. I didn't know who you were at first, Mr. Harris continued, his voice filled with emotion. But then, one day at the diner, I overheard you talking to one of the other waitresses. You mentioned your husband, Eric, and how he had worked at the factory before it closed. That's when I realized I had contributed to your pain, Sarah, and I've been carrying that guilt ever since. Sarah's hands trembled in her lap as the weight of his confession settled over her. She didn't know what to feel: betrayal, anger, sadness, or all of it at once. This man who had been her saving grace was also the source of her greatest hardship. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Harris sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. "Because I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew, you would hate me, and I couldn't bear that. I've spent so much of my life making decisions that hurt people without ever realizing it. I thought I could make it right by helping you, by giving you the car, by, by trying to ease your burden, but I knew I couldn't hide the truth forever." Sarah stared out the window, her mind racing. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights, but it felt like her entire world had been thrown into shadow. Everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down in an instant. She had been struggling for so long, trying to make ends meet, trying to keep her family together after losing Eric. And all this time, the man who had caused her pain had been quietly trying to fix it. But was it enough? Could she ever forgive him for what he had done, even if he hadn't meant to hurt her? "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I, I don't know how to feel." "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mr. Harris said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I just needed you to know the truth. I couldn't keep lying to you, not when you deserved to know everything." Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks as the weight of his words sank in. She had been so grateful to him, so thankful for the kindness he had shown her. But now she didn't know what to think. Could she really trust him? Could she forgive him? The car came to a stop outside her apartment building, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with emotion, the weight of the truth hanging heavy over them both. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You changed my life, Mr. Harris, but you also took something from me that I can never get back. Eric, he never recovered after losing his job. He was never the same." Mr. Harris's face crumpled, his guilt palpable. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt anyone. If I could go back and change things, I would. But all I can do now is try to make amends, in whatever way I can." Sarah looked down at the keys in her hand, the symbol of the life-changing kindness he had offered her. She didn't know if she could forgive him, not yet. But as she sat there in the stillness of the night, she realized that holding on to the anger wouldn't bring Eric back. It wouldn't change the past. With a shaky breath, she opened the car door and stepped out into the cold, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She turned back to Mr. Harris, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time." And with that, she walked away, leaving him sitting in the car, the weight of his confession lingering in the air. Trust had been shattered, but perhaps in time, forgiveness could find its way through the cracks. The cold night air felt like needles against Sarah's skin as she walked away from Mr. Harris's car, her heart heavy with a storm of emotions. Each step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, her mind reeling with the revelation he had dropped on her. She had always known life could be cruel, but this was something different. To have the man who had helped lift her out of despair turn out to be the one responsible for her suffering. How was she supposed to reconcile that? As she reached the door to her apartment, she paused, gripping the doorknob tightly. Inside, her children were fast asleep, unaware of the turmoil that raged inside their mother. She pushed the door open quietly, the warmth of the small space welcoming her in. But tonight, it didn't feel like home. Nothing felt like home anymore. She sat down at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet night. The car keys lay in front of her, a cruel reminder of the kindness she had come to rely on and the truth that now tainted it. She stared at them, her mind spinning. How was she supposed to feel? Grateful for the help that had changed her life? Or angry at the man who had unknowingly caused so much pain? The memories of Eric flooded back to her. The way his face had fallen the day the factory closed. How he had struggled to find work. How the stress and disappointment had weighed on him until he was no longer the man she had married. She had lost him long before the accident, but she had never fully allowed herself to accept it. And now she was being asked to forgive the man who had started it all. A man who had tried to make amends but had kept the truth from her for so long. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands, the weight of it all crashing over her like a wave. For so many years, she had carried the burden of survival alone, never allowing herself to lean on anyone, never allowing herself to hope for something better. Mr. Harris had been the first person to change that, to show her that maybe, just maybe, kindness still existed in the world, but now that kindness felt like betrayal. As the night wore on, Sarah's mind raced through every possible scenario. Could she forgive him? Could she continue accepting his help, knowing what she now knew? Part of her wanted to throw the keys back in his face, to reject his attempts to make things right. But another part of her, the part that had been worn down by years of struggle, knew that holding on to anger wouldn't help her. It wouldn't change what had happened, and it wouldn't bring Eric back. It was in the stillness of the early morning, just before dawn, that Sarah made her decision. The next day, she drove the kids to school as usual, their laughter filling the car, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She smiled for them, making sure they never saw the conflict that raged in her heart. After dropping them off, she drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she made her way to the diner. When she arrived, she saw Mr. Harris's car parked outside, just as it always was. He was sitting in his usual booth by the window, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. For a moment, Sarah hesitated, her heart racing with uncertainty. But she knew this conversation had to happen. She couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, but the sound felt like a drum beat in her ears. Mr. Harris looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he saw her approach. He had been expecting this. She slid into the booth across from him, the air between them thick with tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mr. Harris watched her carefully, his expression filled with regret. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted, her voice steady but strained. She glanced down at the keys in her hand before placing them on the table between them. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what you did." Mr. Harris nodded, his face lined with guilt. "I can't take back the past, Sarah. I wish I could, but all I can do is try to make things right." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and understanding. "You took something from me, from my family that we'll never get back. Eric, he was never the same after the layoffs. He lost his hope, his purpose, and I lost him long before he died. You had a hand in that, whether you meant to or not." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Mr. Harris's face crumpled with the full force of his guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping him. "But," she continued, her voice softening, "I also know that you've done everything you could to make amends. You didn't have to help me. You didn't have to give me the car or show me kindness. But you did. And I can see that you're trying, that you've changed." Mr. Harris's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he listened, his heart heavy with the weight of both the past and the present. "I can't say that I forgive you," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not yet, but I can say that I'm willing to try. I don't want to carry this anger with me anymore. I've spent too many years holding on to pain, and I can't let it control me any longer." She took a deep breath, the weight on her chest finally beginning to lift, just slightly. "You gave me hope when I had none, and for that I'm grateful. But this, it's going to take time." Mr. Harris nodded, tears spilling over his cheeks as he reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'll do everything I can to make sure I earn it." Sarah didn't take his hand, but she gave him a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, and that was more than she had expected when she walked into the diner that morning. As she stood up to leave, Sarah glanced down at the car keys once more. They were a symbol of both her pain and her hope, a reminder of the complexity of life and the choices people made. She picked them up, slipping them into her pocket. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was a process, a series of small steps toward healing, and maybe, just maybe, she could find peace somewhere along the way. With one last look at Mr. Harris, Sarah turned and walked out of the diner, the cold air biting at her skin. But this time, the cold didn't feel quite so harsh. The road ahead was still long, but she knew she could walk it, with or without the help of a stranger. And this time, she wasn't walking alone. As Sarah walked away, she knew that healing wasn't an overnight journey, but with each step, she was moving closer to peace. Sometimes life gives us unexpected twists, and it's how we face them that defines who we are. Forgiveness, hope, and resilience. These are the things that help us rebuild, even when the world seems against us. If this story touched your heart and made you think, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want more inspiring and emotional stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Join us on this journey of life lessons, resilience, and hope. Thanks for watching.